Hi everyone, welcome back from your tea. We're about to start, we are starting now, the next panel. Panel 2, it's on conveners, brokers and intermediaries. And we have with us today Prema Govindran, Director of the Independent Living and Caregiver Support of SG Enable. She's also the Secretariat for Alliance for Action for Caregivers. We have Leonard Patisolano from the Director of Leaders of Good and VPC, and he'll talk to us about brokering collaborations. Ms. Tan Suin is Senior Director of Corporate Services and Grant Management from Tote Board. Oh, Tote Board people in the room clap hands, but nobody else did. Wow, so terrible. I think people forgot to clap, but they're still busy eating. And we have Ms. Cynthia Chang, who just got promoted to Assistant Dean of Experiential Learning with effect. First, we had to change, right? We had to change, She was head of Office of Service Learning and she got promoted. So congratulations. She'll talk to us about connecting students to community. And really the theme here is if the kind of really unappreciated and unseen role that conveners and brokers and intermediaries do, even though we have kind of focused on mutual aid and self-help communities coming to help one another. This role is often unseen, and there's all of you kind of bring to the table a different kind of platform, a different kind of connection. There's the government as a convener, MVPC more as a convener of your peer organizations. There's a sense that you're also closer to corporate donors than others might be. So there's a bit maybe the nonprofits can get to know their funders. Tote Board has recently decided that, not just give money, but we need to orchestrate and catalyze. And so actually part of this conference has been a lot of it due to Tote Board's vision in playing a kind of more integrating role in the sector. And of course, we should not forget students. Students are the future, and often service learning and community engagement in schools, sometimes there's this kind of interesting tension, right, between learning outcomes and what, the nonprofits have their own social outcomes and organizational goals, and it'd be interesting to hear how you try to bridge that. So without further ado, can I invite Prema to share with us about AFA?
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here to share about the Alliance for Action. Of course, I have the unenviable task of representing government as the convener, the Cheng Hu per se, and what comes with it, right? But I thought I'd start with giving you just a little bit of a background as to how the impetus for this alliance came together. So the Singapore Together conversations, emerging stronger conversations, really need to bring the ground together, to share feedback, to really look at collective impact. But the so what needs to be answered, and how do we do it? And so the vehicle that was chosen then to get these conversations going into some level of actionable solutions is the Alliance for Action. So the principles of the Alliance of Action are one, that we bring together people, grounds up initiatives. The Cheng Hu government plays a little bit of a backseat role. The second part of it is that it should be nimble and agile, so that we can pivot along the way, change things, not just stick to the plan when the plan is not working. And lastly, that it should have some level of impact, a proof of concept, or at least a call to action. Okay, so the emerging stronger conversations brought up caregiving and caregiver support quite strongly as an area that we needed to focus on. And that led to the Alliance for Action for Caregivers of Persons with Disability. Caregiving is a long journey. It's cradle to grave, and there are many ways to deal with it. So you have many kinds of support along the way, social service agencies doing their work. You also have startups trying to do different things. But one of the things in our journey that we've discovered, and I think this is very important, is the power of caregivers themselves. And this is a group that we haven't really harnessed on the potential to really lead and drive initiatives. So I'll start now a little bit about the role of us as conveners. And important to see how the government or government-linked organizations who have oversight and really try to drive these programs work. So one of the things I thought, SBS mentioned the superheroes theme and Avengers, but I think what we are really air traffic controllers. So I say air traffic controllers because we kind of know what's happening around, have some sense of using levers to make sure that things, if things go wrong, we know where to nudge for things to happen. But really, we are not driving the plane. We are not flying the plane. And I think that's an important point, to know that we must let the grounds-up initiatives organically develop. The other point I want to make also is that there is this tension and knowing when to come in to help and knowing when to let things go organically. So I use the 3 C's to express our role. So the role of SG Enable and NCSS is really to do 3 things. 1, act as a connector. We do have levers, we have platforms where we can get startups, new initiatives to really get the help they need. The second part is catalyst, and this is an important role, okay, to really catalyze others who are in that same arena, trying to do same things, to get a shared agenda and work together. And lastly, something I feel is sometimes not thought about too much is champion. I think the role that we have is also to champion, one, in getting the encouragement for the core group that we put together, but also to champion the cause. When we selected these 2 projects for the Alliance for Action, we were very motivated and compelled and excited about it. Never done before. The first one is Project 3I, which is caregiver-led. So I mentioned that we can harness caregivers' potential, and this is truly a reflection of it. So it's a tiered model of support in the community, but lacking a proof of concept. So what we are doing is just giving them the levers, sharing platforms, getting them connected. The second one is what Justin is involved in, IPS, and its community circles. So he will be able to, I guess, share some of the pitfalls and some of the good things that's happened through that. So I want to just share some learning points along the way as conveners. The first thing I feel is that we need to start right. Get the first things done first. And the thing that we try to put together is to do a few things. One is to link ourselves up to at a macro level, to national goals. Okay, so you have the Enabling Master Plan, which SPS is a co-chair of. The need to do that, I think, is one, shared agenda, and the other is really to help us to build on levers. A lot of new initiatives get stuck because they're not linked up to certain national goals or even levers like that. The second part, at the micro level, I think we made a deliberate decision to keep the core team small. So rather than go with the whole steering committee, start everything together, we kept it small. And beyond that, it's really to look at, within the core team, we always use the word, right, terms of reference, but I think what we did was terms of action. And I think Justin will be able to contest to that because we went about making sure that everyone had something that they needed to do and bring something to the table. So those were some of the things that we put together. So learning points. Firstly, common sense is always not common. It's not so common. And I think that's an important point to make. Because firstly, when we look at logical things that we do, right? If you need volunteers, you go to a volunteer agency that looks at development of volunteers. But that never happened. Justin will attest to it. Instead, caregivers themselves came up to want to volunteer for the first community circle. So we were moving in a different direction. Common sense doesn't prevail. The other part is when we look at communities, especially ethnic communities, what works for a Chinese Mandarin-speaking community may not naturally work for the others. So one may need resources that need to be translated, which we did with the Chinese Chamber. The other one, with Malay community, for example, we learned that you really need to have conversations and bring fun into the equation. Caregiving is complex. So let's have conversations around it, stories, and really build that relationship. So these are things that we are still developing. It's a work in progress. The other thing is to, when you leave things organic, right? I mentioned the tension between really coming in and guiding and steering, and then the other part of letting things just go organically. But what I can say is that not all things can be left to just grow organically that way. So we must be able to come in and provide that sort of guidance. And I think that's a very important aspect, because as much as we want that groundswell and things to move, it may just fizzle off because of that lack of helping to just nudge and put together. So these are some of the things that we have learned, and I think I'll just stop there. I hope that gives some fodder for some of the other things that we want to talk about. So a lot of what I mentioned just now is just common sense. But the important part for conveners who represent the government or link to government agencies is to understand the tension, know when to go in, offer that connectedness, offer the platforms, and also then to take a back seat and allow things to grow. Community circles, for one, would be something that will take some time to really establish. Project 3I, on the other hand, the Caregiver Support Initiative, I feel has already had some proof of concept, but what we need to do is really be the ones who bring it to platforms of MSF, the Enabling Master Plan, to really then sustain and scale up these things. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Prema. Over to you, Lena. I know MVPC, I've always tried to keep up with a lot of things that you do. You have collabs, which try to convene entrepreneurs, nonprofits, social change makers, and kind of talk about a particular issue. You also have Grant Up Central, supporting grant initiatives. And now I'm going to hear about Leaders of Good as well, which is connecting nonprofit leaders together. Over to you, Leonard.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you, everyone. Really glad to be here today. I think many of you are very familiar with MVPC, but perhaps for some of our newer friends, MVPC is the steward of the vision of a city of good for Singapore, where people, organizations, and leaders come together to give their best for others. So it's a lot more about being other-centered as opposed to self-centered, and it's about striving not just to be the best in the world, but to be the best for the world. We are a company limited by guarantee and part of the extended family of MCCY. Not government, but very close to government. And as Justin alluded earlier, we do have a range of networks with different stakeholders, be it companies, through Company of Good, and so on and so forth, and ground-ups and so on. So he mentioned an initiative called Collabs, which is a community-based collaborative approach. And perhaps I'll take a moment to share some of the lessons, operating as a broker, as a convener. I will say that we are not experts. We have made many mistakes. We have fallen down many times. But it's about picking yourself up, learning from those mistakes, and then try to progress. One of the key lessons that we've learned, and I'll just share five key points. One of the key ones that we learned is it is about a mindset, right? Do we have a mindset of zero-sum game, winner-take-all? Or is it something that is a little bit more generative, inclusive? How do we start? What is that mental model? So that's the first one. The second key lesson that we've learned is the importance of trying to look at the wider system. So the analogy we use is the elephant, right? So we're all quite familiar with that. Different parts of the elephant, we see different perspectives, but how do we take a moment to step back and try to look at that wider view of the system? And in so doing, also bear in mind the considerations for different stakeholders and perspectives. So in a way, the subgroup or sub-points to this wider system piece, right, is the stakeholder group of the people that we're trying to help. So this is along the lines of nothing about us without us, right? Always keeping that in mind. That was a lesson that we had to learn the hard way, right? How do we involve the people that we're trying to help? The second stakeholder group within this wider stakeholder or system kind of map is a group that we call the brain trust. How do we think about or engage stakeholders who have many years of experience in a particular space, deep expertise, right? How do we bring them aboard? How do we engage? How do we help them help us, right? How do they sort of serve as ambassadors or advocates as well? And the third group within that system is the backbone organization. I think for those who are very familiar with the collective impact principles, that's a key element to it. How do such organizations or setups or networks actually allow initiatives to sustain and carry on? Right? So that's the second point in terms of that wider system. The third sort of key lesson that we've learned is the importance of data and taking a very evidence-based approach. right? And not only learning from the hard studies, but also the insights that we glean from our networks. So whether is it interacting with the non-profits, interacting with the grown-ups in Grown-Up Central, interacting with companies in Company of Good, there are many lessons, anecdotes, sharings, and learning points that we can glean and then bring together as a wider system. So data and learning. The fourth point I will share is about trust. Right? I think we all understand the importance of that, what are the conditions for that. But being human, we will make mistakes, we will trip up, there will be communication breakdowns, misinterpreted intent, right? And that's going to lead to the erosion of trust. So it's not just about building trust, but paying attention to how do we rebuild it, right, when it erodes. So that's something that we always have to be mindful of. And maybe the last lesson that I'll share is with respect to patience, right? I think just chatting among some of the panelists, fellow panelists as well, we recognize that a lot of these things take time. And as humans, again, we tend to overestimate what we can do in the short term, but underestimate what we can do in the longer term. Right? So that's some of the key learnings that we've had along this journey. And maybe just before I wrap up, I'll hand over to Suyin, just to talk about why all of that is important. Right? All these factors, all these learning points are critical in creating the conditions that allow us to function, right, as a broker, and allow change to happen, because it provides the conditions that allow a common language to be formed, right? Common language, common understanding, which then will lead to a common agenda, right? So these factors also help to overcome some of the challenges that we face, which is how to initiate and sustain certain initiatives, right? So when we have some of these blocks and these foundational pieces in place, it does help to advance that, right? So maybe I'll just take a pause here.
Thank you, Leonard. It sounds like all these values of trust and patience, you know what, not usually non-profits or organizations think about. It's like kind of spiritual, and I kind of like that. Thank you so much. Over to you, Suyin.
Thanks very much, Justin. And first up, to all of us here today, thanks for coming. It's been a pleasure meeting, so many friends, seeing so many people in the room for the first time. I'll just share a story. I met a friend, a couple of friends already in the room today, and I actually asked, why do you come today? And the answer was actually, they are attracted by the topic, the solutions that help us help one another. And really, I think in this room today, TOBOT doesn't profess to be the experts. I think many of you here in the room leading ground-up initiatives are really the people who know the ground, see the ground. I think our role really as conveners, as TOBOT IPS, is really to bring all of us together. And we do hope that in so doing, we can have these generative conversations. Just over break time, we had a very nice chat. Again, about whether or not after today, is life going to change for us? Are there going to be ideas? Really, we do hope that today's session will allow everyone to have these serendipitous encounters with unexpected people. So really, before I comment on my speech, really thank you everyone for coming. So really, I think to remind everyone as to what TOBOT is. TOBOT is a statutory board under the Ministry of Finance. So very much we're governed by government rules and so forth. And for the traditional view of TOBOT always has been that of us as a funder. Justin beat me to it. He says that actually we have tried to, over the past few years, be more of an orchestrator. I hope to speak a bit about that. Really, as a funder, I think many of our constraints are the fact that our revenues are from gambling, which is not intended to grow. And really, we channel gaming proceeds back to social causes across the board, different sectors, different objectives. So what do we mean by pivoting to a convener orchestrator role? Really, I think as we see it, we are not the experts. We have our vertical pillars in our ministries, be it MSF and CSS, and we want to play that horizontal role in really pulling the different verticals together in trying to identify if there are white spaces in between the different pillars, as well as work with the existing ground-up groups to see how we can all help the system. And I think the point that I wanted to make in what is the most important premise in becoming an orchestrator or convener, I think it's really where we want to go and what drives us, what is our purpose. And really, I think all of us are here and all of us do the work we do because we have that shared goal, shared purpose. We want to do good. And as Mr. Ang said just now, we want to do good well. And I think we all have that, and that is that starting point that we all have. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we have different resources, we have different starting points, we have different KPIs, we have different things that we measure success. So I think that those are perhaps, we think, are hurdles in getting us to the destination, but important hurdles. And I think these are things that we want to talk about so as to remove roadblocks in order to help us really help the ground impact lives. Besides this conference, which we have organized, I think this is the second time round we're doing it, TOBO also funded some attendees at the Baltimore trip. I think Justin led the trip, along with Rachel and many others, several others in the room today. And we're proud that I think we managed to get this trip off the ground going, to see the different things that were happening in Baltimore. And I think existentially, as a funder, the natural question is, so what are the project outcomes from this? So really, I think even as we pilot things, whether it's about gifting circles, whether it's about study trips, I think often as a funder, we want to consider, well, how best can we work with all of you on the ground to determine those outcomes, determine that impact, so that we can make a bigger difference to the lives of people. The things that I think TOBO have done over the years really, I think, pale in comparison to some of the things that you do. We just really do want to help the system. So even since 2018, we've been helping in the nonprofit sector, helping with automation, with organization development help. So really, it is us understanding what the ground needs more. I think the learning point from many of my conversations this morning already are that we are really not experts. We don't know what we don't know. And the only way we can really keep up is really to keep ahead by listening to the ground carefully, seeing what the needs are, and working together with the different conveners. I want to say a bit about our capacity and capability building work. And I think we know, I think Singapore is very blessed to be full of very intelligent people who have actually come from various sectors. Some of you come from finance, some of you come from sectors that were not social as a starting point. But I think the sector now has many, many skilled individuals with loads of skill sets that really will help the sector in the next lap. There are many, many challenges. We all know this. Whether or not it's how we work with underprivileged, whether it's how we work with government even to augment the things that government cannot fund. But all of us are really working towards that same goal. And I think I've been privileged to actually work with many people here who didn't start off in social services, but actually found this their calling, whether or not on your second mount or otherwise, because this is really something that Singapore needs, something that really matters, and matters to all of us. So really, through our capability and capacity building work, we hope to partner with nonprofits to help fund into areas which would help build capacity, not just as a funder, but as an orchestrator. How to do that, I think we also need your help, your feedback, to see how we can do better, because money can't solve all problems. We think they can, but perhaps they solve maybe more shorter-term problems. I think we need creative ways. The ideas that have been mooted so far and discussed on co-ops and so forth, I think we're still at a very nascent stage. I think we have much to learn from others around the world, whether it's in Africa's or America's. But I think there is the gumption to change. There is the gumption to do different. But I just wanted to end off by just saying talking about some of the challenges that we face as perhaps a government funder. I think this conference, attests to the fact that even between IPS and TOBO, we're so proud to have been able and humbled to be able to work with our colleagues from IPS, from the organization of this conference, which has gone swimmingly, but really the knowledge partnership, the stuff that IPS provides, the stuff that IPS is good at. And I think that's important for all of us to figure out in the ecosystem, what value do we bring to that table? It sounds corporate, but I think it's important because we don't want to go around stepping on each other's toes. Me as TOBO, I don't want to go around saying I know the best. I don't want to go around saying I have the most connections, because I don't. But, being very upfront, we have the money, we have the ability to fund. How can we do so in a way that is good use of public funds, has adequate governance, but yet helps you to do those projects, do those things that will make a difference? The second is, I think, I've said this throughout my message, a collaboration. And I think collaboration shouldn't just be lip service. It is really putting ourselves in each other's shoes. So as much as I've spoke about how Tobot needs to put ourselves in our beneficiaries' shoes, our SSA's shoes, I think the consideration when we talk together is how, some of our other counterparts can also put yourselves in Tobot's shoes. Because we do want to achieve those outcomes together. If we can just understand a bit why sometimes the answer is no, perhaps then we can turn that into a yes collectively, collaboratively. And really, actually, most fundamentally, what we need to change is the cultural mindset, perhaps. And Tobot as funder, I think we're trying to move away from the image, and we've been doing convener, orchestrator type activities for years already. But very much, I think, even as we work with many of our grantees, we are still seen very much as a grantee-grantor relationship. I think we should continue working on how this can be a partnership. Again, not just lip service, but really understanding what needs to happen, what needs to shift in order for us to work more closely together. So to round up, Justin gave us some homework. We are supposed to talk about improvement points. So again, I'll be quite open. I think we are not perfect. We want to say that actually we can do better in some areas. And two of the questions that we perhaps keep us awake at night is one of the impact. And I say this, I think if you were here at last year's conference, we talked about impact giving. Many agencies, many of us are very much into considering not just moving beyond measuring outputs, but talking about impact. And I think the definition of impact across the board is something that is still being, we still not landed. Different people have different understandings of that. And I think the concern, the worry from a lot of our grantees or beneficiaries are, but we don't have the resources to manage impact. So if, say, Tobot wants us to measure impact, we will have challenges. I would say that we're all in this journey together. Tobot is committed, like many of the other funders, to work with you to determine how best to measure this in a practicable way possible, but yet with enough accountability to our stakeholders. And last but not least, I have to leave you with governance as a dutiful public servant. Unfortunately, governance is a double-edged sword. So as much as we would like to fund many of the very exciting, interesting initiatives that I think have been discussed over tea, over the panels, I think the question is always governance and how much. And I think there's no hard and fast rule on this. I do think that we as the public service, we also need to consider, I would even on a personal basis say, we would actually need to take a step in faith to actually think about what needs to be risk-based, targeted. How can we best work with you to still achieve our governance requirements, but yet help you achieve your goals? With that, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Serene. I already hear kind of themes coming out from Leonard and Yon sharing. It's about we are not the experts, and it requires a change of mindset. And I think that kind of signals, interestingly to me, that the people who do this work, who broker and convene, often realize that after some time that we can't go it alone. We don't know this. We don't know everything, and I think it's the stance of humility that I think makes the work go well. I'm also very glad to hear that some audience members say that, we came because the title attracted us, solutions that help us help one another. And actually, it's thanks to Tobot. Because if we had called it Mutual Aid and the Commons, I think maybe half the room would be filled. And last year, we almost called it Research, Evaluation, or Impact, right? And then, thanks to, this kind, not so, and so it became good enough evidence for social good. So it was repetitive and long. And then we thought we had to keep to that tradition. So you have help and help, good enough and good. Anyway, thank you so much for that. Over to you, Cynthia.
Sure, thanks. I really resonated with what Suyin just mentioned. We are not here to be the experts in the room. With the curation of this particular topic, I really appreciate that Justin invited Institute of Higher Learning to be on the panel as well. Oftentimes in the landscape, the ecosystem of collaboration, institutions of higher learning may not necessarily be seen as a stakeholder in this ecosystem. But first, maybe a bit of background. What is an Office of Service Learning? We connect community members or community partners and facilitate collaboration between faculty members and students with our community partners. Almost every single institute of higher learning has a service learning office. We may have different names, we may have different focus, different philosophy and approach, but almost every institution has one. I have my colleagues here in the audience from SUSS, but I also know that we are part of a community of practice, the Singapore Service Learning Community of Practice, and we have member institutions here in the audience as well. So hoping that we'll all have an opportunity to connect and be able to see how we can co-contribute to this ecosystem of collaboration. But first off, how in the world did we start a community of practice? 2017, 8 years ago, we started the Service Learning Office, and we were going, as part of an Asia-Pacific network, we were going on these overseas conferences and meeting each other from different IHLs, not in Singapore, but overseas. And after a couple of times of doing that, it suddenly occurred to us that, we're collaborating with other institutions overseas, but we're not collaborating with each other here locally. And that's how we started this very informal community of practice. How we operate is that there is no one single owner. We do not have a secretariat. Each member institution takes turns hosting and takes turns setting the agenda as well. Okay. I have a couple of things that Justin has asked me to share about what we've learned. I mentioned just now that all service learning offices are guided by some sort of a philosophy. We often refer to this as the key elements of service learning. They vary between institutions, but generally comprise a couple of these following elements. One is the most important one of all is the principle of reciprocity. This idea that for students and for the institutions as well, I serve you in order that I may learn from you, and you accept my service in order that you may teach me. It's a really, really important principle for all of us working in service learning, and this is attributed to Tim Stanton. The reason why this principle is important, of course, is at first glance, when you hear the sentence, right, or this phrase, it seems very transactional. It seems like it's just, I do something for you in order that you do something for me, right? But in reality, what it does is that it transforms the power dynamic between those who are serving and between those who are doing the service. Right? So the idea is that there is something that is intrinsically available only in the community. There is that knowledge that only resides in the community. And in order for me to access that knowledge, for me to learn that knowledge, it's only fair that I offer service in return in order to learn that from you. And you, in the community, you are owners and guardians of certain knowledge that is unique to your community. And you accept our students to go into your community to serve in order that you can better teach them about this knowledge that is unique to your community. So this is the relationship that we are gunning for when we go for service learning, and that, to Justin's question about what we've learned, is really that it requires partners who can accept that this is what they want for their communities as well, in order for us to have effective partnerships with them. And the other thing, of course, I mentioned there are other key elements. Community voice, very important that we respect the priorities of the community in deciding what it is that is to be done in the community. Student voice as well. In order to respect the agency of each member, the students also have to have an important say in what is to be done by them in the community. Of course, respecting the perspectives of the community members as well. Another element is meaningful service. Really, really tricky to decide what is meaningful service. It's a little bit like saying impact, right? How do you define it? Meaningful service for us oftentimes means something that is meaningful to the community, defined by the community as their definition of meaningful, as well as what is meaningful to the students. So both parties have, in some sense, almost equal say in terms of what is to be defined as meaningful. And then, of course, reflection, the idea that learning is iterative and we learn from each other through reflecting on our experiences. Because every single institution works, IHL, right, works with so many different partners at any one single point of time. Actually, the processes and the policies that each of our IHLs take on have an oversized impact in the community. We, at any one point of time, every IHL is probably working with at least 100 different partners. And so when one institution decides we're going to institute an 80-hour community service requirement for all undergraduates, and we're going to do it next year, or we're going to say like every single undergraduate from a particular discipline must do something that relates to their discipline as service learning. These, because of the scale, the quantity, the numbers of students involved, has an outsized impact on community members. And these decisions, very easy to do it in meeting room, right? Like among management, but actually there's a lot of that social responsibility that we have to think about when we're deciding on these policies. And so consultation with community members is really important. Oftentimes it is something that we need to guard against. The term often used is service pollution. We make these kind of decisions and we go into the communities and there is that sense of service pollution. Community members often, or community partners often sometimes need to scramble in order to meet the needs of the institution. So we have, as institutions of higher learning, we need to be very mindful of the kind of impacts that our policies and our decisions make on community. For example, we also in our network share during the pandemic decisions like whether to immediately stand down on all activities for all students. What is the impact of that on services in, say, for example, in student activity centers? If you immediately say we shut down everything, all volunteers are no longer allowed to go into the schools, into centers. What's the impact of that? The other thing, of course, is also, I think at the early start of the pandemic, there were a lot of requests to, could you get your students to distribute things, distribute hand sanitizers, for example. And there's also that consideration, we don't know enough about the pandemic. If we're mobilizing volunteers, are we actually participating in that spread? So those considerations are there as well. And these are things that COP members then maybe share with each other about our considerations, different perspectives, different approaches. For us, service learning is as much about the students learning through service with communities as it is about our institutions learning how to be of better service to the communities. And so really appreciate that we have this opportunity to learn from all of you in the room. The other thing is that we position IHLs as community resources. So we rarely reject community partners, but over the years, of course, we have developed some sort of experience in terms of what kind of profiles of partners will work better for the conditions in a IHL than others. So for example, when we started out, to be honest, many larger agencies couldn't really understand what is the role of an Office of Service Learning and perceive our work as being irrelevant to the ecosystem of collaboration. They are the ones involved in real work, professionalized, have been trained, whereas our students are casual volunteers, don't have a role in the system. This has, of course, changed over the years as more organizations understand what role officers of service learning can play in being able to be that facilitator or connector between students, faculty, as well as community priorities. The other thing is, I think, this idea that maybe service learning officers are merely here to supply volunteers. Our work is really not just to make students volunteer, it's part of the equation, but there's also the idea of connecting theory and practice, that link between theory and practice. And so whether there's that ability to have that exposure and long-term experience that provides an opportunity for students to be able to clarify their values. Remember I mentioned one of the key elements is meaningful service, right? So clarifying your value on what does it mean to be able to provide meaningful service? Is something like a giving circle meaningful service? How do we determine whether that is meaningful service or not, right? And these are questions that you can't think about it in thin air or from just reading a text. You actually have to have that experience with the community before you can conceptualize these ideas for yourselves. So for organizations that are willing and interested to be part of that journey with students, those are the ones that are suitable, I suppose, or the ideal partners. Organizations who are looking for hands and legs, who are not considering student mentorship, who think of mentorship as being extra work, those kinds of relationships generally tend to be rather unsustainable. I'll give an example. We were once approached by an organization that was very well resourced. They had a deck. And the deck they showed to us to propose collaboration was the exact same deck that they had shared with a secondary school just maybe a week before. And I asked, had they shown this deck to any other IHL? And they said yes. Also last week, another IHL. Was there any collaboration with that IHL? No. There was no result from that. And I think the point of me telling this story is actually about finding out what is appropriate. So the organizations that work best with us and that we work best with are very, very clear-minded in terms of their strategy of why they're working with an IHL. So they may have a specific strategy in terms of the age group, or the lifespan, or the discipline, or the skill base, or even the future career of the people that they want to engage and do outreach with. So, for example, in our partnerships, we may have organizations that specifically want to do service learning collaborations with our students who are involved, who are majoring in early childhood education. And the reason why they want to do that is because they want early access to early childhood educators before they even become early childhood educators in the centers. So that's a very, very strategic outreach. And same with, say, human resource management majors. Before they become HR managers, if you want to get them on like inclusion, diversity in the workplace, before they go out into the workplace while they're still students, we work with them on a service learning project. That's some example of ways to strategize working with different IHL partners. And of course, different IHLs have different disciplines, different age groups, different skill sets. And so, choosing which institution to work with for your project or for your organization's strategy matters. And I mentioned earlier also the role of being a co-educator. So there has to be that match in the community's priorities. You want to co-educate, and therefore you take on this collaboration with us. And also, of course, that match in terms of the learning outcomes that you want for the students and the students want for themselves as well. I think the ideal partners are what we are looking, or the ideal partners are the ones who are looking to groom advocates and who are keen to invest resources in order to be able to groom these advocates. And I guess finally, one thing Justin asked about whether we should be neutral or to shape agenda is that while as officers of service learning, while we try not to impose our agenda on communities, we have to be very conscious about the fact that any type of service learning collaboration is a form of intervention. Anything that we choose to do, like we choose to partner this particular organization rather than another one, or we choose to curate the project with a specific topic in mind, or we choose to invite this particular resource person or speaker or mentor, each of those choices is already an intervention. So we're very conscious about the responsibility of that. I'll end here, and looking forward to sharing with everybody.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that masterful kind of overview of how service learning really, as you put it, really is a community asset, important in the ecosystem that people don't think about. And I think you're basically the spokesperson for all the service learning officers now, because you've you've painted the value that you can bring, and I also kind of the way I see that value is, if you ask for, I mean, not the non-profits here. Some non-profits are so busy fighting fires. Say, you want volunteers, students. What do you want the students to do? Oh, you want to do Flag Day because it's free labor, right? So they do terrible things, not terrible lah. It's, there are other things they could do, but they do Flag Day, they clean old people's house or whatever it is. But actually, as you're right to point that there's skilled volunteerism. These students are connected not just to you, but to the faculty, right? There's engineering, there's culinary arts. If the non-profits are not thinking, they would say, okay lah, Flag Day. But if the non-profits are realizing that, this poly has a culinary arts institution, and my community isn't eating very well, can they create a culinary arts experience in our community kitchen which creates food that's both healthy, nutritious, but also culturally kind of specific to our taste? Then wow, that would be great, wouldn't it? But they're not thinking of that. So now think about it and go to Cynthia, and Cynthia will connect you to all the different service learning officers in all the IHLs with their own disciplines and peculiarities and when and how to work with them. So for now, I would like to actually, before we open it, there are many kind of questions coming in already. Maybe just to kind of latch on to the point, the last point, which is, do you as a neutral platform, or do you shape the agenda? And the view was that you always are shaping the agenda in some way. And I thought I would like to hear, and you said, Prema, that sometimes you have to step in and back off a little bit. And I wanted to understand that a little bit better on how you think about doing this. When is it right to step in, and when is it right to step in with an agenda? When to let go and let other people's agenda take the stage?
Yes. I think some of the things that have already been mentioned is this whole idea of work in progress. So I don't have a full answer for you on how that works, and there's a miraculous methodology around it. But I can say this. Firstly, being aware that that must exist. And I think that's the first step. Being aware that there is that tension, and we need to manage that tension, know when to go in and when to come out. So I'll give you an example. For example, with Caring SG's Project 3I, when they were seeking funding, and I want to also say that Tote Board and Temasek Foundation stepped up to want to help. But that entire process is very new to a new setup. They don't understand what funding principles may be. How do you express your KPIs, the outcome? And they went in with a very passionate call to say that, caregiving is important. I'm a caregiver myself, and these are the things that we need to do. So I think going in then to help them, even to come up with the funding parameters, what to write in those things is important. So that's the kind of parts that we must do. So as much as we say government stay back, we do have the levers within us to help in this process. So what has happened as a result of that? Caring SG is now set up as a CLG. They've already started having a whole database of more than 2,000 over caregivers and stakeholders in their network, done much better than SG Enable could have in that caregiver scene, and very quickly. So what we did was to help them move along that path. There are times when we need to make sure no one gets derailed, because often in this process, new people come into the fore, very exciting, suggesting things like employment for caregivers. But you kind of need to go back and say, do we really have that kind of time to look at so many varying pieces? Let's look at things that can move faster, low-hanging fruit, and then drive them in that way. So it's not so much that forced, structured way, but to always be able to calibrate and help them along the way. And I think that's an important point. So as much as we let a lot of things go organically, what does success look like? At the end of the day, there should be some level of a proof of concept, a call to action. And that's something that if you want funders to move in and help you with that cause, that needs to happen. And I'm unabashed to say that nonetheless, the reality check, the elephant in the room, is really the outcome. So we have to also be drivers of that outcome.
Lorna, I wonder if you had any views on that. As I'm thinking about this, even as a moderator, I can decide on whether I should be a neutral moderator, or just field questions and you answer, or do I kind of shape the direction of the conversation in a way which I think is productive? And that's always in my mind. actually, I kind of feel that it's easier just to be neutral, right? But then you're not getting what you care about. So I wonder what MVPC's experience is.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Justin. I think it's a very valid point, right? Because being too neutral or just letting it go or letting people decide, what their agenda may be, could very well be counterproductive in the longer term, and again would actually kind of possibly derail your own ability to function effectively as a broker and a convener. So it's necessary to be able to have that sensibility. Now, when it comes to the agendas, I think it's always helpful to also remind yourself that it's not so easy to just manage people's agendas, right? I think as a start, we need to be able to listen and to be very sensitive, to get a very good sense of what are the underlying issues, and to encourage people to say more, so that and you pay attention to sometimes not just what is being said, but what is not being said. Right? What is the underlying pieces that are, or factors or sensibilities that are influencing certain mental models or the way that they think or the way that they do things? So, for example, when we were running the collabs for migrant workers, many different voices in the room, many different views, and we had to rely on different teams, and we had to rely on facilitation experts as well to help manage that tension, not so much the agenda, but the tension, right? And is the tension heading in the right direction? Because if it's destructive, then obviously, we have to put a pause to it, right? But does the tension, like Justin enjoys certain debates, right? Or that kind of energy, that a tension that actually is creative, results in a greater understanding. I think we can appreciate a lot of times that just getting a certain level of awareness and understanding is so difficult. Right? How do we have that better collective awareness, right, of the different issues and the mental models at play, right? So that's I guess one thing in terms of whether you want to kind of manage, curate, step back, step forward. It's a bit of a dance. It's an art, and you kind of really have to sense it. If I may just add on a little bit in terms of the resonance with some of the points made by the other panelists, right? Cynthia, you talk about that being able to connect the theory and the practice, right? When we think about leaders of good and what it means to be a leader in the community, I think one key aspect is the interior, right? How do we nurture that interior, and the ability to reflect, right, on some of these experiences is critical. And sometimes the volunteering exercise can be mundane, not necessarily engaging, but there is still an opportunity to reflect on what that opportunity may be, or what that opportunity provided. And then, when you rely on certain skills, that works too, right? So it's almost like skills-based volunteering for students. But we do encounter situations where, let's say, working professionals, right, after working in a particular skill or area, and then when you ask them to volunteer in that same space, they're like, oh, I can't do this anymore. Right? I need to kind of take a break from that, but I still want to be able to make a difference and contribute to the community, and it's fine too, right? Different strokes, different folks. So I think just some of the sensibilities in that regard. Prima talked a little bit about what does success look like. I think for us, and in the context of collabs, one way of articulating what success looks like is when we're able to activate empathy. Right, having that immersion, walking in the shoes, understanding what it means. That's one dimension. Another form of success is being able to expand the cognitive understanding. So again, leveling up the knowledge collectively. And sort of the third dimension of what success looks like is how do we build community? Because that is a key element in sustaining the work, right? This is the for us, by us sort of dimension. Yeah. So a few quick thoughts there.
Thanks so much, Leonard. And I wanted to go to Swin because then you talk about community building being this thing that sometimes leads to relationships, trust, and empathy. And I wanted to hear from the government point of view, right? Is that are these outcomes that are meaningful enough? Because you can build empathy, strong relationship capital, but then you don't focus on the solutions. But is that outcome meaningful in itself from your point of view to support and then count that as an impact?
Well, I can't answer on behalf of government, but perhaps I'll speak for Tobot. From a personal standpoint, as a citizen, as a member of society wanting to make Singapore better, I think to determine whether some of these soft outcomes, the learning and so forth, is adequate, I would say that at initial pass we'll say no, just that knowledge, just the hit knowledge, it's never enough. I mean, whether you're bringing up a kid, whether or not you're taking care of your elderly parents, grandparents, I think the change of heart, the empathy that I think we hope that civil servants, public servants will result in better outcomes because we understand the ground better. Then we can help you help everyone in the system co-create and define what that impact is. I think there are some questions on impact as to how do we measure impact longitudinally and so forth. Do we have the patience? I think a lot of it, there are no straight answers. It depends. For many projects, it depends. Can we pilot? What's our risk appetite? So really, I think the reason why I think many of us mentioned humility and empathy is really, once we put ourselves in each other's shoes, we do want to try to achieve good outcomes. We want to try to shape the measures, the KPIs together. Yes, it's not going to be an easy journey. We may disagree. We used the word agendas. Actually, I don't like the word agendas because naturally everyone comes from we want to achieve the same goal. We may come from different starting points. We may have different skill sets, we have a different lens depending on our experience. But I think the reason why we need the empathy as government is so that we can step in someone else's shoes to understand what the difficulties are and say measuring. And then what can we do in the interim period, and what is the longer term impact that we want to then achieve. And it's not one size fits all. So really, I think for many of these, we have no questions. But again, I think this is the start of a conversation. I think many agencies many of you are looking at as to how best to measure impact. I think we want to be partnering everyone in this journey, and we too are learning. Yeah, thanks, Justin.
Prima wants to speak on behalf of all of government.
No, not really. not really. Actually, I just was going to share a tangible example because ToteBot is one of the bigger funders for SG Enable's work. And the tangible example is this. When we look at KPIs, I think the narrative is important. And government being present, government-linked agencies being present in that conversation to help out that new project that's coming, I think has value. So I'll give you an example. So in funding, for example, Temasek Foundation funded some aspects of Caring SG's Project 3i. Never been tested. It's just right now at theory form. But they wanted SG Enable to come in to be the intermediary. So as long as we were there as an intermediary, that gave them the confidence to want to be able to do this. And then alongside that, we come in to guide the process. So I think there's some things, levers that we can use to bring in the narrative and walk alongside. And I think that's where the empathy, and the understanding of how this happens. So I feel that that's the way we're going. Another aspect of KPIs, right, what success looks like, is really around areas like self-efficacy. Do people feel that they can access, instead of really looking at the larger quality of life, really come down a few notches and look at self-efficacy? Are people able to access information better? And I think these are some of the conversations that we've been having with our funders, and that's helped quite a bit to shape and maybe nudge us a little bit differently.
Cynthia, did you want to chip in on anything about outcomes, or you don't have to? I'm just wondering whether you want to. What we'll do now is I'll ask one more question and then open it up to the floor. The next question I want to ask is about the unique characteristics of each type of stakeholder that comes to your networks and platforms, right? There's government, there's funder, there is non-profits on the ground, sometimes members of the communities themselves. And in my own experience, when government is in the room, sometimes the poor policy officer comes to a small round table. Then everyone look, hey, government in the room, what is government going to do? Then why is a policy like this? And then, the person, of course, cannot answer on behalf of government and struggles. Is very stressful. And then for funders, every time a funder is in the room, say, hey, they get solicited, right? Are you interested in this project, that project? And so the funders have very cleverly set up some protection amongst themselves, right, to stop all this kind of constant solicitation. So I wanted to hear from you from different backgrounds, like your stakeholders are different, students, faculty, community. What are some of these stakeholder types? And what do they care about, and how do you manage it such that they feel comfortable coming and can contribute? And even, have there been cases whereby you bring people along and there are fist fights, or I would love to see that besides just angry arguing. If people don't get along, what do you do? Who would like to go first?
If I may?
Yes.
So one of the things that helps us when we try to bring people into the room And I think I can appreciate what Justin is saying about, if it's a poor policy officer that comes in. So again, like we're doing the migrant worker collabs, and we have our friends from MOM in, and it's like, oh, how do we make sure they don't get slaughtered? Because everybody is here trying to make a difference. They have their constraints and so on and so forth. But I was just thinking one way that we try to practice, right, is in a way to kind of leave your titles and your organization at the door. Just practice that and try it for a moment. Yes, at a certain point in the conversation, you will have to come back in. But just at the starting point, let's try to connect, as people who care about a certain cause, right? How do we draw that sort of a common connection? Another way to try and manage this is also to think about what are the requests and offers, right? So everybody comes in with a request, but you also come in with ability to make an offer, and then you get that exchange going. Yeah. So maybe just pause there for a moment.
Thank you so much. Who would like to go next?
I think we go through this on a daily basis in trying to kind of calibrate a little bit, but be open to suggestions. And I think that the posturing is important of how we bring these conversations to mind. In our case, it was clear that from the start that the key influencer is the caregiver. And that has changed the direction of the topics that we bring up and the experience. I mean, Justin knows because he's part of the committee. And Dr. Lim Hong Hui, she is a medical doctor and also a caregiver of 2 children with disability. So you see that when you are able to, as government, as a convener, to bring in key influencers to wrap around the discussion, because it is sensitive. I think that is tactical. Rather than we go in and say, okay, this is the funding, this is what you do, and this is the structure, and you go on. I think that we are far from doing that for quite some time already. I was with MOH and then HPB. Conversations generally are generic, organic. We see things that have potential, and we then latch onto it and say, let's help you alongside. I said, so we don't lead, we just go alongside you and try to go. And I think that's important, key influences. The second part I wanted to say very quickly is value proposition. I think we need to sharpen our value propositions to different communities. If you're speaking to young people, okay, and you need to say, hey, come on board with us to help with caregiver support, there must be some meaningful value proposition to them. And I think we need to shape our conversations around that, knowing that customizing certain value, what is it, what's in it for me? Okay? And I think these are some conversations because we're so focused on the outcome, we forget to have. And this is when the relationships are built. And we find people knocking on our door. We are seeing a lot of that happening now, where people want to come in and say, how can I play a part? Because perhaps in some way you create a trusting environment. But so key influencer, value propositions, I think these are 2 things that need to happen.
Thank you. Cynthia or Sweet? Cynthia?
Sure. I think you asked about the tensions, right? Some of the tensions I think we can see are, I guess, in our context, the funders, what do the funders want in terms of outcomes, impact? Usually it tends to be that if the focus is on student outcomes, then the connection to that funding is more productive, I suppose, from the context of an IHL. But I think one of the other tensions is also in terms of outcomes that perhaps some of the agencies that we're collaborating with want. Perhaps maybe sometimes focus on visibility and things like that. But because this is meant to be that applied experience, right, for the student. And so that tension, that messiness is actually real life, right? That political agenda, being able to navigate those agendas with sensitivity, knowing how to position something in one way versus another way, those are all part of the learning experience. And so that's something that I think we work very hard to say that we appreciate that as a part of real life. The other thing, of course, is also the idea that as an institution, we work with our different community partners to connect dots. So it's different assets, different organizations are actually potentially assets to each other, but maybe because they need that role of this panel, right, the convener, in order to be able to make those connections between the assets. One of my colleagues in the room curates a project where it's intergenerational, working with senior activity centers, with early childhood centers, with the CDC, many different assets within the community being linked together because of the fact that they're working with this IHL.
Thanks, Cynthia. Suyaneni, when people find that you work for Toba, do they ask you for money?
Well, the answer is, of course, the answer is yes. But I think that's, I mean, again, as a person, I think that's entirely normal. So I don't take it personally. But really, I think to your question as to what are the challenges or otherwise the tensions, I think often, it came up in the line of questioning in Padlet or that online questioning thing. How it is that we define success? What is that? How do we cross that finishing line? I think the important thing is for us to all understand we want that same goal. So I mean, I sound like a broken record, but it really goes back to that. So, and the question that's asked to us is, can we do a longer funding? Can we be patient capital? Can we wait a few more years? Actually, what's the underlying question? Underlying question is, perhaps the impact measures as currently framed may not be realistic to be materialized in, say, 2 years. So that is the, I think, question and conversation that we need to have, and that can only come from trust. Again, it's, your impact measures are impossible. There's no way, I don't have resources to build this. Yes, I agree. I agree with all of what's that feedback that's given. I feel the same way to a certain extent. But underlying that question is, I'm struggling. I already can barely keep my operations going. We're very lean. We're losing people all across the sectors. So with the understanding, what is that middle ground that we can reach that will still meet our governance requirements? What is that middle ground that can we reach that perhaps I think for many of us that we can perhaps test, pilot some of the perhaps higher risk or even things that we accept is an unknown, and we go and make that step. So yes, there are tensions, but I don't think any of these, well, I won't say any, but I don't think many of these tensions are insurmountable. As long as we have that gumption to really speak to each other, I think that is an important starting point. I think many of these conversations, these questions, are actually an important starting point for many of us here in the panel. Thank you.
I'm going to go to you next. Very hard to hit 500 people for next year's conference, no? Then the underlying is, I'm just too tired, I have 2 kids. And then you share some child rearing tips with me. Now we will open up to the floor for questions. If you would like to go up to the mic. If you can think about whether you want to go to the mic, but we have some questions on Padlet already. I'm going to skip the first one. Do we need Forward SG? Because they can't speak on behalf of Forward SG, right? So, but the next one is on Leonard and Prema. What are your views on whether some of these convening initiatives can be done by citizens? NVPC and SG Enable are both still very closely government linked. Could the government go beyond being the convener to enabling citizens to be the convener?
Absolutely. I think that's definitely possible. But it's really looking at readiness. And I think, for example, with Caring SG, IPS, the development and nurturing, I think it's very important to start first to nurture some of this, to get them to be seen and known, visibility, which is what we do. But as we do this and we go along, I think we then can wean them off us. And when that process happens, it offers them to just drive. Because that is exactly what success looks like to us, to not hold on to this project forever, but to really just help along the way once we feel that, okay, ready to launch up, in a sense, to let them move ahead. And that's why Caring SG also is an entity on its own, so we're seeing some success factors along the way. So absolutely, I think that's possible, but we need to give them the levers, to get them familiar with the whole ecosystem of support around them, the partners that can come in to help you, and just understand the journey better.
What about you, Leonard?
Yes,
NVPC collab or citizen collab?
All of the above. I think everybody needs to get involved, right? And I second what Prima said, right? In fact, the more that happens, right, the better it is for all. I think the fundamental challenge in that approach is where how do you assess the legitimacy or the credibility, right? And how agencies like SG Enable and MVPC can help citizen groups or community groups attain some level of, I don't know, that sort of legitimacy in a sense, almost like a transferable social capital kind of idea, right? So in Ground Up Central, where we work with a lot of self-initiated groups, the idea is that we want to be able to empower them to do that. And if part of their cause is rallying, others and being a convener, all the better. And it's a case of, okay, how can we help you achieve that? What are the conditions that you require? Is it some form of legitimacy, assurance of some sort of backing? Yeah, then let's have that conversation. So definitely up for it.
I wanted to add on to that because it's so important. There's legitimacy when an organization supports, right? EFA is highly legitimate. Of course, it's also very formal, I see already. Then, of course, Billion is the chair. Then, everyone very proper, say the right things. So, except for Billion, right? Because she so it's so wonderful for legitimacy, but also very scary. And then you have the citizens one, the stuff I do with Denise, like, it's like a cocktail party, sometimes with wine, right? And so I wondered to what extent would you feel that for an organization to support these things, it's going to be very hard to, let go because there's your own reputation at stake. Can IPS support some of these things? Question mark. It's something that I always have to think about. But can Justin be? Sure, can lah, right? So what do you think from, there's this kind of always a deliberation, even for Cynthia. What do you choose to support? How much of it do you have to understand before you support it and put organizational resources into it?
I think it really requires the opportunity to engage and sense, right, from these stakeholders or these citizens, what is that genuine attempt or effort or idea that they have, right? And insofar as we're able to support, we will do our best. Like we may not have the direct resources, but we will have the networks to be able to connect, right, to other resource groups, right? Whether is it in terms of knowledge or capital or people and so on and so forth. I think we want to be able to leverage on our different platforms and networks to allow that to happen. I think in terms of to what extent you can go, it's a bit of a judgment call, right? I think if we are able to see that there's evidence that there's some risk that is evolving or emerging, then it's like pick up the phone and say, hey, there's some feedback that's coming in, something's not working. We need to be able to be open enough to have those courageous conversations where, hang on, something needs to be discussed.
Sorry.
Did you want to say?
Maybe I'll just put it this way. As much as you win some of these projects for them to be independent per se, I think we must remember that we are invested. And just as parents would, you grow the child, and they move on, but you're still invested. And I think you can be invested, from far away, but nonetheless invested. So, which is why I mentioned earlier on that we need to start right. Establish the parameters properly, plug into proper systems, really get them kitted well so that they can then move off and really do well. But investment is important, and I think that shows in how we build a relationship. We stay on course to some extent, fail, and I think failing is okay, no problem. We're quite excited usually to just say, hey, this one didn't happen, let's pivot. So it's that sense of really coming together. Collectively, we see the vision, we want to get there. We know it's hard, but we're all invested. And everyone in that core group, which I mentioned, is a lean team, was carefully selected for that because we feel, I'm sure Justin's going to be with us for the long term and be invested in this as well and see it through.
You know how to get people to do free work. Very clever. Give them, join this important sounding committee or the, Singapore Children's Society, very clever. Justin, would you like to join our research committee? Then you join, right? Then whatever I would have charged them as an IPS or as consultant, now free, because you joined the committee. You're so honored to be asked. I also joined. MVPC also got me. Vincent Ng has asked. Vincent is a general manager of Good Space. He says, most panelists have alluded to the idea that we are not the expert. What is the one thing you have had to unlearn in practicing this philosophy? So the ones who said were Bernard and Suyin, right? But Cynthia and Prema, feel free to contribute as well. Who would like to go first? Why not Cynthia? Cynthia, it sounds like being part of the IHL, you are experts and you work with the experts a lot, right? So is this less of a relevant question for your role?
I would say that officers of service learning are quite unique in their positionality within IHLs, because of course, in the IHL and with the pecking order in an IHL, right, your faculty and the research done by faculty and the knowledge that is being created by faculty, of course, are on, in terms of pecking order, are considered at the top of the pyramid. But officers of service learning play a very different role in that pecking order, because the idea is that that's the facilitator of that connection of collaboration between community and students or faculty. And also the idea that we do so because we recognize that there is knowledge that exists, and I mentioned this just now, there's knowledge that exists exclusively within the community and is not in the domain of academia, right? And therefore, suddenly faculty and the university cannot possibly be experts in that area. And so it's not really an area of tension, because this is the very premise of why we have such intermediary officers in the first place.
I think the other point is that we need to start off understanding that each of us brings something to the table. We all have strengths. So in that sense, you don't go in, even if you represent the government or IHLs or anyone else, thinking that you know all the solutions. And I think that mindset, starting right, I keep going back to that, starting right, the right principles when we came in. The other point I want to make is relationship and trust, right? And a lot of times we spend a lot of time building trust with stakeholders and those things, but not very much with funders, not very much with the government. And I think that's an important aspect. With the funding that Caring SG has gotten from Temasek Foundation and Tote Board, we are in constant contact to say that, hey, we may need some time, things have happened well, we share with them case studies or what has happened and those bits. And I think just journeying along with the funders has helped them to then also look at things a little bit more realistically. And I think that's a very important point. We've been doing that very deliberately, updating funders, updating government as to where we are. So I feel that those are some things that help us in this journey. 100% not without problems. It's a work in progress, but I feel that what we need to do is really sharpen some of those areas that we're working in. It's not ground zero.
So before Leonard and Suyin respond, it just occurred to me that I've been practicing this terrible thing when I was a young teaching assistant, right? I set myself up to be the expert. Because when you're a teaching assistant, you feel like you have to deliver the answers to the students. I would deliberately structure the whole tutorial, set up the question such that, in the end, you don't know, right? So puzzling, right? I will tell you the answer at the end, because then that legitimizes my status as, trying to become a sociologist or an academic or researcher, right? And that was the game that was being played. I realized the game. And it was so terrible because it didn't need to be that. But because our status or prestige is at stake, that became the game. And it took some unlearning to do, like Vincent's asking. And also sometimes people ask me, you ask pretty good questions. How do you get to ask good questions? And my response to that is, it doesn't take intelligence to ask good questions. It just takes ignorance. And that's something I had to learn. Just be kind of upfront about what you don't know. Right?
Yeah, so I spoke about culture, and maybe I'll just say a bit more about that. So quite apart from the high-level view that culturally we have to change our grantor relationship and be more partners, I think it's really the ability to say that we're willing to pilot things and even say that we're willing to fail, as long as we take learning points from, and it's ring-fenced and we have all the caveats because of governance. I think the ability to say that we're willing to invest in pilots. So I think we have invested in shared gifting circles. We didn't cover that very much today. So we had actually 7 agencies that 7 organizations that came and joined us. I think there are loads of learning points from many of these gifting circles, learning circles, because not all of us are created the same. So I think a lot of this, the conversations that we're having this morning, first presentation on co-ops, presume certain things, presume that people are natural leaders, are able to lead the whole circle. Sometimes in real life, that's not always the case. So I think for government, perhaps the question is, are we ready to pilot things in a controlled setting? We're prepared to fail. I think these are things that I think not just Tote Board, but the whole of government is also themes that we're exploring. And I think this hasn't really landed. We do hope to, really learn. But really, how can we approach and mitigate some of these risks? It's things that we're still working through.
I would say one thing that we had to sort of unlearn is this whole mental model around results, right? But just intuitively speaking, we recognize that these are very complex issues, right? You cannot expect, the deliverable or the outcome just to happen, but we still find ourselves trapped in that. Like, what was the outcome of this effort? Has the collaboration started? What is the progress? So it requires a bit of mindfulness and discipline to give ourselves that time and space to kind of step back and say, okay, let's just recognize that certain things are in place, right? Certain conversations have taken place. The journey has begun, and then take it from there.
Thanks. There's a really interesting question right down at the bottom on, it's asking Tote Board, but I think we should all answer it. Would you consider the idea of showcasing and learning from failure or failed projects for the next conference? Learning from failure is key to creating a culture for creativity and innovation. And what I've heard here is, yes, we're very open, we want to, but how brave are we into doing, actually showcasing the failure? I have a colleague in IPS, Shamil, and we've been talking about doing a failure fest ground up, right? Mutual aid, but then this one serious Tote Board IPS conference on failure, or NVPC on failure. What would all your response to that be?
See that, Justin, can you bring in 500 people for the conference?
If it's failure fest, I think we can for sure. Come and share your failures, not your successes. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess again, it goes back to mental model, right? In Japan, I think that's something that is expected and celebrated, that you share failures. So fail well in that sense, so that you can then not make the mistake and people move on. But I think the basic thing is that we need to share practices. And this platform gives us a chance to really share some of the pitfalls, the blind spots, for example, and also what has been successful, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's so many things that's happening out there, which probably is stuck in a certain limbo somewhere because they have not learnt from another group that has probably done that well. So I think that sharing practices, knowledge sharing, thought leadership is another area that we should be looking at a little bit more deeply. Yes, failures, I think, very important. But to share it around, what went wrong, what did we do to pivot, and those bits. Again, it's more in moving things forward, not so much as, we got stuck here, finish, don't have to do. But it's more in how can we move that. So what? The sense of curiosity. Why did it not go right? How else can we do it? And just questioning a lot of that. And I think that's some of the things that we constantly do with Bilian, with Hong Hui, who's the caregiver, who also kind of gets us on the right plane of things to say that you need to understand from a point of empathy as well.
I'm just thinking to myself, like, wow, we were to do this, it's in a way very progressive, right? Because you've got to stop and then reframe how you have been traditionally wired to communicate, right? And I think one of the conditions that, if you imagine, and I fast forward one more year, maybe 200 more people, and it's a case of what is the level of psychological safety in the room to be able to bring that out, and that's going to be quite an interesting kind of experience. I have a title for you. I mean, since you want the No Solutions that help us help ourselves, the first trigger that came was an old movie called, kind of old, Jerry Maguire, right? Not the Show Me the Money, but the, Help Me Help You. So maybe a flip to next year's would be, failure is an option.
about we failed to fail. So it's like a humble brag, right? I must repeat. How our failures fail to fail, whatever. Anyone else want to add on to this before we break for lunch?
Well, maybe I'll just round up that question, given that Tobot was mentioned in this. I think whether or not it's at this conference or at any other meeting or otherwise, I think it's important to have that forward-looking lens, not to go navel gaze and to witch hunt, but really have that forward-looking lens to say that actually what are the learning points from this? And that's always positives, even in purported failures. There are always lights, there are always things that we can glean and we can always do better. I think often the human nature is, but we can't come out and say, we didn't do well. It's not the case. So I won't put it to Justin as to next year's conference, but I do want to encourage all of us, including my own teams. I think we have to consider what went right, what went wrong. And I think for that, we'll all be stronger and better.
Yeah, I just wanted to second Leonard's point about the psychological safety, because, if I use the example of our community of practice, in the original iterations or in the discussions very early on, 2017, the original idea behind setting up this community of practice was that the different IHLs would host each other and share the challenges that we're facing, and because other people are doing similar things in other institutions, perhaps these brilliant minds who come for that meeting would be able to give us some insights into how we could reconsider or switch our perspectives in terms of how we're approaching things. That never quite happened. I'm just going to be honest about it. Never quite happened, I think, because of that culture, right? We have a culture where if we're hosting somebody, we better show them the best parts of ourselves. And so I guess the question is how, through branding or whatever, switching that into an asset, right? The failures, how do we reposition that as an asset? Really interesting.
Thank you so much. And if we actually do something like that, we must institute a rule, because I assure you, people will come and brag about their failures, right? My PSLE is so low, but look, now I'm a CEO. Then very irritating, right? So with that, thank you so much to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause. We'll break for lunch.